Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Tuesday, August 6th, 2024. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today, 5 U.S. troops injured in rocket attack in Iraq. So at least 5 U.S. personnel were injured in a rocket attack on the Ain al-Assad air base in western Iraq. And this was first reported by Reuters on Monday, later confirmed by the White House. And they said President Biden and Vice President Harris were actually briefed on the attack and briefed on the overall situation in the Middle East. The U.S. officials who spoke with Reuters said that one of the Americans who was wounded had serious injuries and that the number of casualties could change as the damage is still being assessed. Iraqi sources said that 2 Katyusha rockets were fired at the base. And this attack comes about a week. It was last Tuesday that the U.S. launched airstrikes in Iraq against the Popular Mobilization Forces, the PMF. So that happened, and of course this comes as the whole region is on edge as they're expecting an Iranian reprisal attack against Israel for killing the Hamas political chief in Tehran. And Iran's allies, including the Shia militias in Iraq, who have taken credit for previous rocket attacks on U.S. bases. We haven't seen the U.S. Formally blame anyone for this attack yet, but previous ones have been attributed to the Shia militias in Iraq that are allied with Iran, and there's a chance that they could be involved in the Iranian response. Right now, no indication that this is part of Iran's response. I think this is probably a response to the U.S. airstrikes in Iraq last week. This was on, again, last Tuesday or July 30th. The U.S. launched airstrikes in Iraq that killed 4 members of the PMF, and the strike on the PMF was strongly condemned by the Iraqi government, which is supposedly the U.S.'s partner in Iraq. It just goes to show what a mess the whole situation in Iraq is. The PMF is part of Iraq's security forces, yet they've been engaged in this conflict with the U.S. for a while now. And the U.S. airstrike that was launched last week came after there was a few rocket attacks on U.S. bases in Iraq and Syria. There was no damage or casualties in any of those attacks, yet the U.S. still went ahead and launched these airstrikes and killed a few of them. And just a background on this, I know I go over this a lot, but it's important just to have the context. So we're talking about the rocket attacks on U.S. bases in Iraq and Syria. From October 2023, they started a lot of these attacks in response to U.S. support for Israel. And U.S. bases came under attack hundreds of times from October until February of this year. Around that time, 3 U.S. troops were killed at Tower 22 in Jordan, which is a secretive U.S. base in Jordan on the Syrian border. After that, the U.S. launched, a lot of airstrikes against the Iraqi Shia militias, and the Baghdad government and Iran convinced these militias to stop attacking U.S. forces, and the attacks have been rare since February. There's a few in April, and then these most recent ones, I think, were a response to the fact that the U.S. hasn't made any progress toward a withdrawal from Iraq. The rocket attacks came right after the U.S. and Iraq held talks. They put out a big statement, but there was nothing concrete on the U.S. withdrawing. Because that's another thing here is that Iraq's prime minister, again, this is supposedly the U.S.'s partner. He's been calling for a U.S. withdrawal, but the U.S. is dragging its feet. They don't want to leave. They want to stay in Iraq, even though they're putting the troops in harm's way. I mean, if things really pop off here with Iran, Iranian missiles can hit these bases hard, and a lot of Americans could get killed. And this is something I've been warning about, that we might see these Shia militias kind of get in on the Iranian reprisal attack by attacking the U.S. bases. So it's just, the whole situation is just such a mess. And the U.S. is saying that they're going to respond, so they're probably going to launch some more airstrikes against the PMF. And again, this is putting clearly showing that it's the U.S. and Israel versus Iran and its allies in the region. That the airstrikes that the U.S. launched in Iraq last Tuesday, that came just a few hours after Israel bombed Beirut and killed a senior Hezbollah commander. So again, showing that there is two clear sides here. And the casualty number could change. The U.S. officials who spoke with Reuters said that they were still assessing the damage. I saw some things on Twitter that said 2 U.S. troops were killed. I don't think that was right. There was actually just recently 2 National Guardsmen from Georgia died in Iraq in incidents the Pentagon said were non-combat related. They announced that just the other day, but that was separate from this, so maybe people are getting that mixed up. But that's strange that 2 American troops did just die in Iraq of non-combat. It's what the Pentagon said were non-combat. And they were National Guardsmen, and it's one reason why I think, I haven't talked about it as much as I should lately, but I think people should get involved with the Defend the Guard Act. That is state legislation that would ban the federal government from deploying their National Guard overseas, because that's who's deployed in Iraq and Syria. And, it's not all National Guard, but there's a lot of National Guard there. And that's one way that the federal government has been able to continue these wars is by deploying the National Guard. So if you take that power away from the federal government, it could have a significant impact. So if you want to get involved with that, I always put the link into helping phone bank with Defend the Guard, volunteering for that, or you could just go to defendtheguard.us to check it out, and you could see the information about your state and the status of the legislation. And again, the link to the phone banking is always in the description of this show. All right, so the next story here, Israel is considering preemptive strike against Iran. So Israel is considering launching a preemptive strike on Iran as it is awaiting a reprisal attack for the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran. So they're calling it a preemptive strike, but is it a preemptive strike? Was killing Haniyeh a preemptive strike? So they've already done a preemptive strike. It just sounds like they're considering attacking Iran again. According to Israeli media reports, Israel could launch an attack on Iran if it finds an Iranian strike is imminent. And this idea was discussed on Sunday night in a meeting between Netanyahu and his top military and intelligence officials. Iranian officials have made clear that they will respond to the killing of Haniyeh on Iranian soil, and any Israeli preemptive strike would just escalate the situation even more. Then we might see an even bigger Iranian retaliation than what they are planning. And U.S. and Israeli officials believe that an Iranian attack could happen any day now. They're saying, 24 to 48 hours. They said that on Sunday. So there's a chance that things could happen soon, but we will see. The next one here, CENTCOM chief coordinates with the IDF chief on Iran's response. So on Monday, the head of U.S. Central Command, which is the U.S. military command that oversees operations in the Middle East, General Michael Eric Kurilla, he was in Israel and he met with the IDF chief of staff, Herzi Halevi, as the two militaries are preparing to defend Israel from an expected Iranian reprisal attack. Kurilla also met with Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, who said the visit from CENTCOM demonstrates strong U.S. support for Israel. So Gallant said, quote, "Your arrival in Israel at this time is a direct translation of U.S. support for Israel into action. The relationship between Israel and the United States is unshakable," end quote. So Kurilla's visit came after the U.S. announced that it was deploying new warships and warplanes to the Middle East, specifically for the purpose of defending Israel. And as I've said yesterday, I think that this muscle flexing from the U.S. and these promises to defend Israel, again, making it very clear that they're going to be directly involved in this, I think it makes it more likely that the Iranian response could involve targeting U.S. bases. I would guess in the initial response, Iran would not do it, directly attack the U.S. bases itself. We would probably see the Shia militias in Iraq do that. But then if things get, escalate even more, then we might see Iranian missiles hitting American bases, and that would mean big American casualties. So there's just a lot of ways that this could go. All right. So the next one here, the resistance axis says that a calculated simultaneous strike on Israel is coming. So this article is from the Cradle, and they have sources within, what is known as the axis of resistance, which is Iran and its allies in the region, Hezbollah, and also the Houthis, or also known as Ansar Allah. That is their official name. So Iran, Hezbollah, and Ansar Allah armed forces have vowed to make the occupation state pay a heavy price following the targeted killing of Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran and Hezbollah senior commander Fuad Shukr in southern Beirut. So an official from the Lebanese resistance, which is Hezbollah, has informed the Cradle that, quote, the response will come at once from Iran, Hezbollah, and Yemen. The goal is to inflict a painful blow to Israel, which may not be achieved should separate retaliation be pursued, end quote. So they are saying that they're going to do it all together. They don't mention the Iraqi militias or the Iraqi resistance, as they call themselves, in this. But they're saying other sources tell the Cradle that the response could be coordinated from multiple fronts. The idea is to overwhelm the Iron Dome, all the other Israeli missile defense systems. So according to the Cradle sources, that is what they are planning. All right, so the next one here, Israel sends a truck of dead Palestinians into Gaza. So on Monday, over 80 bodies of unidentified Palestinians were buried in a mass grave in Khan Yunis after they were sent into Gaza on a truck by Israel. So Yamin Abu Suleiman, the director of the Palestinian Civil Emergency Service in Khan Yunis, told Reuters that it was unclear if the dead Palestinians were exhumed by Israeli forces from graveyards in Gaza or if they were tortured and killed in Israeli detention facilities. Abu Suleiman said, quote, the occupation provided us with no information about the names or ages or anything. This is a war crime, a crime against humanity, end quote. So this truck that they sent in, they're not sure, again. So Israel has been digging up cemeteries in Gaza. In some cases, they just destroy the cemetery. In other cases, they actually exhume bodies, and they say that they've done that to look for remains of hostages. So they're not sure if this could be some of those bodies, or it could be people who have died in Israeli detention. According to Gaza's government media office, Israel has taken 2,000 bodies out of Gaza. So on the same day, there was a report by an Israeli human rights organization about the Israeli detention facilities for the Palestinians who were taken out of Gaza, and it detailed more of the torture and abuse that the Palestinians there face. And that said that 60 Palestinians have died in Israeli detention facilities since October 7th. So that's quite a bit, and I read that somewhere else as well. So this happened as Israeli strikes continue to pound Gaza. Gaza's health ministry said that at least 40 Palestinians were killed on Monday in the Israeli attacks, bringing the death toll since October 7th up to 39,623. And that's Gaza's health ministry's number, and that does not include the thousands of people, what they estimate to be about 10,000 people who are missing under the rubble. It also doesn't include probably these bodies, if these were people that have died, that were killed in Israeli prisons, or Palestinians who were dug up, who died after October 7th. They're not counted in the official death toll from the health ministry. All right, so the next one here, Israel-Hamas hostage deal talks on hold after the Haniyeh assassination. So this might be kind of an obvious story here, just an obvious fact, but Israeli media reported on Monday that hostage deal talks between Israel and Hamas are on hold following the Israeli assassination of Hamas's political chief, Ismail Haniyeh. Haniyeh was the top Hamas official outside of Gaza, putting him in charge of negotiations with Israel. He was a proponent of reaching a deal with Israel, and his assassination is seen as an effort by Netanyahu to make sure a deal is not reached. Israeli officials said that hostage deal talks would not restart until after Iran launches its attack on Israel. So they're saying they're not going to resume talks until after Iran's, reprisal attack. Well, what does that mean? I mean, because again, that could really escalate. Israel's saying if Iran hits them, they're going to hit Iran back even harder. And then who knows what this can turn into. So I think there's a chance that these talks might not resume at all if this thing turns into a full-blown regional war. And the report said that the U.S., Qatar, and Egypt have been mediators in the talks. The U.S. has been involved as well. But, obviously the U.S. is clearly on one side in this thing. Qatar and Egypt have been mediating, and they say, of course, things are going to be much more difficult since Israel killed, Hamas's negotiator. So, who knows if these talks are ever really going to restart. And as I covered a lot in the weeks leading up to Haniyeh's assassination, Israeli sources, Israeli officials said things publicly about Netanyahu sabotaging the talks. Even the head of the Mossad, who was in charge of negotiations for Israel, said Netanyahu's demands would thwart a deal with Hamas. So we knew for a while that Netanyahu did not want a deal. But you still have the U.S. I mean, they're still not criticizing Israel for killing. I mean, they're not criticizing Israel for sabotaging negotiations, for killing Haniyeh or anything. You see the State Department press briefings, they're asked about this, and they just say, we don't want to negotiate from the podium or anything. But when they said it was Hamas that was preventing a deal, that's all they talked about. So it's just very blatant hypocrisy. All right, so the next one here, Israeli drone strike kills 2 in southern Lebanon village. So the strikes into Lebanon continue. This article is from Jason Ditz. A pair of Israeli drone strikes against a southern Lebanon village of Mais al-Jabal killed at least 2 people. Described as a Hezbollah cell by Israeli military officials, the slain were described by the military as operating a drone in the area. They were identified as a Hezbollah member, but a paramedic was killed as well. And the paramedic arrived at the scene after the first strike and was attacked in another strike. So Israel said that Hezbollah had been launching explosive drones in the area and crossing the border into northern Israel. So this, again, we're seeing daily strikes. Israel launching daily strikes in southern Lebanon, Hezbollah firing rockets into northern Israel, but still nothing, that's a big escalation since the Israeli airstrike in Beirut. But Hezbollah is saying that they are planning to really escalate this conflict with Israel, and it could turn into a full-blown, Israel-Lebanon war. All right, so the next one here, Smotrich says it's justified for Israel to starve 2 million Palestinians to death. So Israeli Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich said Monday that it might be moral and justified for Israel to starve to death 2 million Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, but said that Israel could not do so due to international pressure. So Smotrich said, and this was at a conference hosted by Israel-Hamas, which is a media outlet. He said, quote, "We are bringing in aid because there is no choice. We can't, in the current global reality, manage a war. Nobody will let us cause 2 million civilians to die of hunger, even though it might be justified and moral until our hostages are returned," end quote. So he's saying nobody's going to let us starve to death 2 million civilians. It's what he actually said, even though, and he called it justified and moral. And this is a guy, this is Smotrich. This is someone, he's not some fringe extremist. He is the finance minister of Israel. He's also the minister, which is this is more important when we talk about the power that he has in the government. He is the minister of the West Bank, essentially, the occupation governor. He has a minister position in the defense ministry that gives him the power to expand settlements. This is the guy that has that power, and he is a settler himself, and he has long been on the record as saying that Israel should push Palestinians out of the West Bank and annex the territory. And here he is saying we should be able to starve 2 million civilians to death. And this is the type of genocidal rhetoric that has been used as evidence against Israel at the ICJ, in South Africa's case against Israel, the genocide case at the International Court of Justice. One thing that is widely, usually mentioned is when on October 9th, when Israel announced it was imposing a complete siege on Gaza, Yoav Gallant, the Israeli defense minister, said that they were fighting human animals, and half of the population of Gaza, about 1 million or more than 1 million, is children. So this obviously is a war on children, as we've seen. And it's just, again, these are the people. He's just lamenting the fact that they can't just starve them all to death, and that they have to let aid in. And, they've let a very small amount of aid in, but he wants none to go in. He just wants to starve them all to death. All right, so the next one here, Israel's Ultra-Orthodox protest first draft notices outside base. This article is from the New Arab. So Israeli Ultra-Orthodox men launched a protest outside an Israeli army base on Monday following a draft call for 1,200 men from the community following decades of exclusion from military conscription. So this is kind of a big development when it comes to Israeli internal domestic stuff. These ultra-Orthodox who are in, study, basically what they study the Torah, and they've been exempted from the draft for decades. So now they are trying to draft them, and there's been very big protests from their community. There's members of the Netanyahu government, ultra-Orthodox parties, who are very against this. And this is just, more kind of internal discontent within Israel. And actually, so the Shah's party, which is one of the ultra-Orthodox parties in Netanyahu's coalition government, has said, he said, don't show up to the draft office. That's what they're telling the ultra-Orthodox men who could be drafted now. Said, don't show up. It's basically telling them to resist the draft. All right, so the next one here, the U.S. completes withdrawal from last base in Niger. So here's some good news. The U.S. is out of Niger for the most part. The U.S. military announced on Monday that its forces have completed a withdrawal from Air Base 201 in Niger, well ahead of a September 15th deadline for U.S. forces to exit the country. So the Pentagon and Niger's defense ministry said in a joint statement, quote, the U.S. Department of Defense and the Ministry of National Defense of the Republic of Niger announced that the withdrawal of U.S. forces and assets from Air Base 201 in Agadez is complete. The effective cooperation and communication between the U.S. and Nigerian armed forces ensured that this turnover was finished ahead of schedule and without complications, end quote. So there's still a small number of U.S. troops who remain at the U.S. Embassy in Niger, but they will be leaving once they finish administrative duties. So for the most part, the withdrawal is complete. And the U.S. began withdrawing approximately 1,000 military personnel from Niger in June. In July, they finished pulling troops out of Air Base 101. So they had two bases in Niger, Air Base 101 and 201. They pulled out of 101 last month, and now 201 is empty. And Air Base 201 was a big base. It was a major drone hub for U.S. military operations in the Sahel region, and it cost over $100 million to build. It's only been operational for a few years. So, of course, this is something the U.S. really didn't want to give up. And the U.S. is in talks with other African countries about kind of establishing a similar drone hub, but there's no sign that a deal has been reached on that yet. And the U.S., so what led to this was the July 2023 coup in Niger that ousted President Mohamed Bazoum. The U.S. stopped cooperating with the military after that. Many of them were previously trained by the U.S. That's a pattern that happens in Africa in these coups. The U.S. trains these militaries, and then those military leaders go ahead and overthrow the government. So the U.S. stopped cooperating with them. Then it looked like the U.S. was going to, deal with them so they could keep the base, but then their hubris got the best of them. In a meeting in March of this year, U.S. officials met with Nigerian officials, and basically the U.S. just scolded them about their relationship with Russia and Iran. And it was after that meeting that Niger said, all right, we're done. They said that they were ending their military relationship with the U.S. and that the U.S. military presence was no longer legally justified. And then the U.S. tried to kind of, it seemed like they were ignoring the request to leave. And there was actually whistleblowers that came out, American soldiers. One Air Force officer wrote to Congress and said, by keeping us here, they're putting us in danger, saying that the Biden administration was trying to portray like they had some good relationship with Niger, but the U.S. soldiers who were there weren't able to get supplies that they needed. They weren't able to go home, even though their deployment was up, because no relief forces would come in. So finally, the U.S. Agreed to actually leave, and now the withdrawal is pretty much done, except for the small number of troops at the embassy. And then most embassies, there is usually like a dozen or so Marines as security. So I'm sure that will be the case in Niger. But yeah, it looks like the U.S. is actually finishing this withdrawal from Niger, getting those troops out of harm's way. All right, so the last story here. So it is Hiroshima Day. It is the 79th anniversary of the day that the U.S. dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. And so we have a lot of stories. If you look at the lower part of the page, we have a whole Hiroshima section. Some stories that older stories that we've ran over the years that have important information about the bombing of Hiroshima. One interesting story is conservative criticism of Hiroshima bombing is worse than Obama's. This is a story from back in 2016 from Jack Hunter. And it was when Obama got criticized by conservatives for acknowledging the victims of the U.S. bombing of Hiroshima, Japan. And that article, he points out that back in the 40s and the 50s, conservatives there were conservatives who were very critical of dropping the atomic bomb on civilians, killing hundreds of thousands of people. So that's very interesting. And then, so we have a story at the top part of the page about one Hiroshima survivor who has shared his story for the first time in 79 years. So I just wanted to read some of that. This is from Japan Times, and this is Mikio Saiki, a 92-year-old atomic bomb survivor from Hiroshima, has begun sharing his harrowing experiences from nearly 79 years ago, a story he had kept to himself for decades. The catalyst for Saiki's decision to speak out about the horrors of nuclear warfare is Russia's invasion of Ukraine. He said, quote, "People around the world don't know the misery of nuclear weapons. We have an obligation to inform them," end quote. He hopes that spreading the reality of the bombing will bring the world closer to the abolition of nuclear weapons and a world without war. On the morning of August 6, 1945, just before the end of World War II, Saiki, then 13, and a second-year student at Hiroshima Daiichi Junior High School, experienced the bombing from his home about 2 kilometers east of the epicenter. He was about to run an errand for his mother when he saw a blinding light. He said, quote, "I was about to put on my shoes when there was a bright flash. Everything turned white, and then it went pitch black as our house collapsed," end quote. His father at a nearby streetcar stop was blown onto a bridge and suffered burns on his left side. Many people were floating in the river he tried to jump into. At his school, about 800 meters from the epicenter, 369 students and staff died. Saiki and others who had been told to stay home were among the fortunate ones who survived. His family members also survived. The next day, a friend urged him to go to school. On the way, they witnessed a hellish scene at Hijiyama, a hill on the city. He said, quote, "Blackened bodies lined both sides of the road, stretching down to the base of the hill. I felt guilty for surviving. I felt sorry for those who died. I knew I needed to talk about it, but I didn't want to," end quote. So interesting that he's never talked about it before now. And, these stories, this is the reality of the use of nuclear weapons and just look at the state of the world today with the U.S. in this proxy war with Russia and all this talk about nuclear weapons, arms control treaties falling apart, the U.S. planning a war with China, which also has nuclear weapons, and Japan would be in the middle of that. The people of Japan would suffer greatly especially people in Okinawa who don't even want the U.S. there to begin with. That's where most U.S. bases are. They would be a major target of China. So this stuff, I think, is important. Of course, it's important, but it's interesting. It reminds me of my grandpa. I mean, it's a very different story, but he was in the Navy in the Pacific in World War II, and he never talked about it until he was in his 90s, until like the final years of his life. And I know other people, similar stories of their grandparents, who were grandfathers who were in World War II and were silent about it their whole life and then began talking about it in their final years. All right, so go check out our viewpoints. We have one from Talif Dean, 79 years after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, a grim reminder of nuclear annihilation. One from Greg Mitchell, Truman's A-bomb statement set Hiroshima narrative to this day. One from F. Andrew Wolf Jr., U.S., Ukraine, Russia war, it's about the money. One from James Carden, Max Boot's Big Grift. And the spotlight from William Hartung, there they go again. Heritage pushes new nuclear arms race. And again, we have the big Hiroshima section. Another thing, if people are interested, Scott Horton put together this list of who opposed nuking Japan a few years ago, going through the U.S. military officials, government officials who opposed dropping nukes on Japan, including Dwight D. Eisenhower, Herbert Hoover, Norman Cousins, General Douglas MacArthur's pilot, President Richard Nixon, Ralph Byrd, the Undersecretary of the Navy, the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, the survey that the U.S. government commissioned that found it was not necessary to drop the atomic bombs for the Japanese to surrender. Japan, that strategic bombing survey said that Japan would have surrendered even if the atomic bombs had not been dropped, even if Russia had not entered the war, and even if no invasion had been planned or contemplated. And they went to Japan and spoke with Japanese officials and everything. So William D. Leahy, the fleet admiral, Nimitz, another fleet admiral. So lots of very high-level military officers at the time who said they didn't need to drop the atomic bombs. So go check all that out. You could always support antiwar.com by telling your friends about it. Share this show, like and subscribe everywhere. We're in very dangerous waters now, so there's always the chance I upload this show, publish it, and then everything becomes irrelevant because Iran might start its attack on Israel. But we'll see how everything plays out this week. Let's hope for peace, that peace will prevail. Anyway, I will talk to you tomorrow. Thanks for listening.